Just a reminder that, like, we're going to talk about dopamine detox today. A lot of the things that people struggle with, and when people have questions like, how do I build confidence? How do I, let go of past resentment? How do I better understand anxiety? Like, how can I develop like a meditation program to help me with like feelings of depression or inadequacy? All of those questions. So what we actually did is take like the most prominent questions in our community and actually package them together in a really formal way. And that's what Dr. K's guides are. So if you guys have, particular issues where like you're watching stream and one day you're like, oh my God, like that's me. I feel personally attacked, Sag. Like, oh, what do I do about that? That's what the guides are there for. I think they really cover like 70% of the introductory questions that people will have. So you guys can, check those out. They should be coming out in about a month or two. So what we're going to do is we're just going to start with Googling dopamine detox. And this is going to explain part of the reason why dopamine detox is tough. So recently I heard about this whole dopamine detox idea. Usually when I hear about these trends or whatever, I ignore them. But this time it was different. Not only did I become more productive, but I also quit smoking. Wow. That's really impressive. So what is a dopamine detox? So like, what is dopamine? Great. So he says that it is a type of neurotransmitter. Okay. Shows a picture of it. Good. Detox is a process where you move something toxic or unhealthy out of your body. This is also called detoxification. This is where things get weird, right? Because in a dopamine detox, are we removing dopamine from our body? So however, what makes dopamine so bad is that is that your brain keeps looking for it over what you actually want. So this is where we get into a problem. So we're going to dig into the neuroscience here. This statement is untrue. So dopamine is what determines what you want. So if we look at like what dopamine does in the brain, it actually determines the dopamine reward circuitry is a circuit of motivation and behavior. So like when you want something, that is because of dopamine. So what is a dopamine detox? A dopamine detox removes almost all dopamine from your body for however you choose to do it. So this statement is so horribly incorrect that it blows my mind. Okay? So this is like saying going on a diet is removing almost all calories from your body for however long you do it. Okay? The goal of a dopamine detox, and this is a really important point which we'll illustrate down the road, is not to remove dopamine at all. We're not trying to remove dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. I don't know if you guys know this, but like Parkinson's disease is the result of destruction of your dopaminergic neurons in a particular part of your brain. And so like if we removed all the dopamine from our body, what we would end up with is Parkinson's disease. This is not true. We do not want to remove the dopamine levels. My point here is that people who are spreading this information do not have... So this was like on the front page. So granted, I used DuckDuckGo. I don't know exactly what would happen if I used Google. Probably be influenced by my search history. So I used DuckDuckGo in privacy mode. And so like the first thing that I want y'all to understand about dopamine detox is like most of the information out there is like done... Sure, like this person had a personal experience and I think it's great that they're sharing that personal experience, but like they don't understand actually like what the goal is. Okay, so then let's see what they say next. Okay, so step one. So how do you just remove it all yourself? One of my favorites from things of the internet that involve self-help and growth blogs. You just remove it. Just remove it, chat. What's wrong? What's wrong with you, dumbasses? Just remove it. Just log out. Just like food, none. Just don't eat, chat. Anything else that gives you dopamine, stop eating. Log out of all your devices. Just stop playing video games, chat. Just stop drinking. Just stop doing drugs. Just cigarettes. Oh, like no wonder he quit smoking. He was like, oh my God. You just get rid of it, chat. For how long do you do a dopamine detox? Most people said for 24 hours. However, there were some people like Alex Becker who did it for much longer. Oh, Alex Becker did it for much. So I decided to go for 36. Wow. That's so horribly incorrect because this does not understand, like this person does not understand the mechanisms through which a dopamine detox works. We'll get to this, okay? Where I failed. Will I do it again? What I don't understand. Most of it, chat. Most of it. Wow, for a fail. So I don't even know. Let's just move on to the next one, okay? All right. So how to reset your mind with a dopamine detox from Project Life Mastery. Okay, so there's some stuff about World Health Organization. Okay, there's a how to reset your mind dopamine detox YouTube video. This guy is smiling and is wearing a suit. Cool. Ready to succeed faster and master every area of your life? Click here to join my Life Mastery Accelerator program. A dopamine detox can change your life. Okay, let's look at the neuroscience. Dopamine functions as a neurotransmitter. That is correct. It affects many aspects of your behavior, some of which include learning, motivation, mood. This is also correct. So this neuroscience seems better, chat. Your brain is addicted to dopamine, and it will try to stimulate the repetition of behavior that produced dopamine in the first place. Technically released dopamine in the first place, not produced it, but close enough, right? We can let that slide. Once you get what you desire, dopamine turns off. As a result, you end up feeling not as satisfied as you thought you would. Sort of. Okay, you may end up feeling empty, okay. Okay, he talks about phenylethylamines here. Falling in love. I'm not quite sure what this has to do. A simple and powerful example is sugar addiction. Dopamine creates a craving for sugar. So he talks a little bit about satisfaction, which makes sense. So this is actually this is pretty good. Oh, wow, look. Discover the 7 proven business models that made me an internet millionaire in less than 3 years. And he's sitting on a car. Get instant access to free video training and get started. Free 4-part video training, and he's sitting on a beach. Discover how to make money publishing books on Amazon. Mastermind your way towards success. Okay, let's go back to this. I'm getting a little bit distracted by, I guess this guy is an expert at Amazon publishing or dopamine. I'm confused. Investing for beginners, supplements, how to master your mind and emotions, how to start an Amazon FBA physical products business. She makes $40,000 per month on Amazon. NLP training, what it's really like to be a millionaire. Okay, I'm a little bit confused about what this guy is. Okay, so here's where things can get messy. When you stop engaging in addictive behaviors all at once, you may experience withdrawal symptoms. This is a dangerous way to detox your system. This is also true. So withdrawal from alcohol and benzodiazepines can even be life-threatening. It becomes the only way that you are able to experience happiness. Please use dopamine. People use dopamine hits as a way to mask negative emotions that they don't want to feel. This is also correct. You can only distract yourself for so long before those emotions rise to the surface and start affecting every area of your life. Sort of true. Best way to reset your mind is to cultivate here and now transmitters. These include serotonin, endorphins, oxytocin, and GABA. Okay, so this is where the neuroscience, once again, is just way off. These neurotransmitters allow you to enjoy the present moment, experience connection, and be at peace with yourself. That's just horribly incorrect. So just to give you guys an example. Okay, so this is Neuroscience 101. Neurotransmitters are like letters of the alphabet. They can be used for all kinds of things. So, for example, serotonin is used in your GI system, and if you get way too much serotonin in your GI system, if you cultivate too much of the here and now transmitter of serotonin, you will end up with diarrhea. This is bad. GABA is a suppressing or inhibiting neurotransmitter that is activated and increased by the use of alcohol and benzodiazepines. Alcohol literally activates your GABA receptors and stimulates GABA production. So this is the one thing that I really notice about, people like this dude who I'm sure that he's trying to help people, and it seems like, he's actually doing a pretty good job with the science. But it seems like his expertise is in mastermind your way towards success. He's an internet entrepreneur, life and business coach, and philanthropist. Right, so it seems like he's not claiming to be a neuroscientist, which is great. But this is so neurotransmitters in the brain and all over your body do all sorts of things. So oxytocin, for example, is also what causes people to lactate if they're, in the postpartum period. So neurotransmitters don't just do one thing. They're actually like letters of the alphabet. So if you think about a letter of the alphabet, it's used in a lot of different words, right? So maybe some letters may be more common in particular kinds of words, but our body, it's basically a signal that the body sends. And depending on where the signal is sent, like in the basal ganglia, dopamine is used for like regulating motor stuff, right? Like how I move. So like, for example, people who have like basal ganglia problems will have like their movement is not smooth with their arms. It'll be like a ratchet movement. So you cultivate these here and now transmitters by slowly starting to remove behaviors that are causing issues in your life. Pick one thing in your life that you're addicted to, whether it's video games, pornography, social media, coffee, or sugar. Give your mind a rest and allow your baseline to return. Just give your mind a rest, chat. Meditation is a powerful way to increase your dopamine levels naturally and reset your brain. I actually don't know if it's true. That's true. I don't know if meditation does anything to alter your dopamine levels. It may. This could be correct. It's also been found to rebuild your frontal cortex. This is true. I don't know about rebuild, but it does improve prefrontal cortical function, which leads to self-control and willpower. That is correct. I encourage you to do some research. I completely agree, because this doesn't seem like a whole lot of research. Yes, chat, I encourage you to do that. If you're struggling, don't give up hope. That's cool, right? That's a message of positivity. Are you ready to do a dopamine detox? Okay, so I don't know exactly what this person is doing, but yeah, so like this is my point. Like, so he's, you know, standing in a cool place and speaking to people and stuff. I just don't know. So this is the problem with dopamine detox, is like no one knows like what on earth they're talking about. Like, I don't get that this person is, you know, this is great. I mean, this is actually pretty similar to what we do, right, Chad? It's like purpose, vision, spirituality, like neuroscience sprinkled in. Like, it's kind of like us, right? So this dude is like happy and he's successful, and there he is in sunglasses with a car. And oh my goodness. Wow. So this guy must know a lot about, you know, dopamine detox. And then there are testimonials. Great. Yeah, so I just don't know. I don't know about this stuff, okay? So it looks like he's got courses. Affiliate marketing mastery, mastering book publishing, the 24-hour book system, amazing selling machine. So I just, this is my point, is like people, what I think is going on right now when it comes to like information about dopamine detoxes is that like people like this, who seems like he's good at selling stuff, right? So his expertise is in selling, and he's like, oh, like this is great. Like people will search for dopamine detox. My website will pop up because he knows about, you know, marketing stuff. And then I will talk a little bit about it. And then presumably people will purchase my products and services. So this is like the problem with a lot of the information about dopamine detox, is that it seems like people just sort of like talk about it, right? But really don't know what they are talking about. So now let's before we get too far, let's look at the flip side, right? So if I were to go to PubMed and do a search for dopamine detox, what would I find? Right? So first of all, I don't know if you guys know this, but you know, if I do, you should see a bunch of papers, okay, when you search things on PubMed. So if I search for dopamine detox, essentially I find nothing. So narcotic antagonists and drug dependence, pilot study showing enhancement and compliance with SYN-10, amino acid precursors, and enkephalinase inhibition therapy. This is the other problem with dopamine detox, which I want everyone to understand, is that dopamine detox has not actually been studied, okay? So there are not clinical trials on dopamine detox. So everything that I wanted to share with you guys today is going to be grounded in neuroscience. It's stuff that I've done clinically. But if we really look at, like, have there been randomized controlled trials on dopamine detoxes? There have not, right? So there have not been actual studies that I've been able to find that have a specific protocol for a dopamine detox and kind of like, you know, how to accomplish it, okay? So in a sense, like, while I'm being critical of these people, like, if we want to be a little bit more fair, we have to at least acknowledge that part of the reason that these people are giving crappy information is because, frankly, good information is not out there yet. So now what I'd like to do is share with you guys my experience of, like, you know, when I've worked with people with dopamine detox. First of all, explaining to y'all how the neurotransmitters actually work, okay? So we can still, so this is where, like, remember that there's like the end of evidence-based medicine, which is like review articles when we have a bunch of studies. But before that, we tend to have clinical interventions. So this is where we can use our good understanding of science, and we'll present with you guys with like good literature and stuff like that. Like, this is stuff that is really grounded in a lot of science, what I'm about to explain. And then we can actually, like, based on our understanding of basic neuroscience, we can actually like elucidate, okay, what's going on in like a dopamine tolerant brain, like what happens in the mind of someone who's playing video games. We can even hypothesize based on what's happening in the circuitry in the brain, what the symptoms should present as. And we'll sort of do that. And then y'all tell me like, okay, actually, yeah, that makes sense. This is actually what I experience. And so if that's the case, then we can sort of do an intervention, which I've done, and I'll explain how to do that intervention and clinically what I've seen, okay? So let's start by understanding what dopamine actually does in the brain. Dopamine pathway. So this comes from Wikipedia, okay? So this is a picture of a couple of important dopamine pathways in the brain. The ones that we're going to be looking at are the mesocortical and the mesolimbic. So, and then the VTA is also important. So these three parts of the brain are going to be kind of where your dopamine reward and behavior and motivation circuitry are. So this is important to understand about dopamine, okay? So dopamine is involved in not necessarily the feeling of pleasure, okay? And we're going to explain this a little bit later. And this is where a lot of people get tripped up. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that our brain uses to reinforce a behavior, first and foremost. So it's not necessarily the feeling of pleasure, because as we're going to discover, hedonics and motivation are actually two separate neurochemical neurocircuits, okay? So hedonics is the ability to experience pleasure, and dopamine is involved in motivation and reward. So when we engage in a behavior that rewards us in some way, that reinforcement is going to be via dopamine. And the two pathways we're going to be looking at the most are the mesocortical pathway and especially the mesolimbic pathway. So this is where the mesolimbic pathway is involved in reward-related cognition, which includes incentive salience. This is huge. So wanting and enjoying are actually not the same part of the brain, okay? Which is going to become important in a second. So dopamine is what makes us want stuff. The liking and pleasure is involved in the mesolimbic pathway, but there's actually a separate circuit that involves that more, which we'll dig into once things get complicated, which is how the brain works. Sorry to say it's not like super simple. And so it also has to do with aversion-related cognition and positive reinforcement. What aversion-related cognition means is that, like, basically if we avoid things, so we can reward behaviors through aversion as well. So like if I don't go to, if I don't ask anyone out to prom, or if I don't go to prom, I'm going to be like more peaceful because, I'm scared of going to prom. I'm scared of feeling alone. I'm scared of all that stuff. So dopamine is involved in that kind of motivational circuitry way as well. It's like the motivation of avoidance. The mesocortical pathway is a little bit different because this involves executive function. So what that sort of means is that our mesolimbic pathway, this pathway here, okay, which goes from the ventral tegmental area up to, I forget what this part is. This is nucleus accumbens, okay? So this pathway is really around motivation and reward. And the mesocortical pathway, so remember our frontal cortices are the ones that give us a sense of control and willpower. So what this means, executive function is the ability to plan out a task over time and execute on those pieces. So if I want to find a job, that involves polishing up my resume. It involves updating my LinkedIn profile. If it involves like these other kinds of things, then applying to jobs, responding to emails, send you thank you notes after interviews. All of those things are essentially executive function. And if we really look at it, this is why it's important. If we really look at it, the key thing about dopamine here is that circuit is not rewarded for each of those steps, right? So the mesocortical pathway is the one that allows us to take actions without being rewarded each step of the way. So when I update my resume, like I don't get a dopamine hit, right? If I update my LinkedIn profile, I don't get a dopamine hit. And yet our brain's ability to essentially execute long-term tasks that are not immediately rewarding are governed by the mesocortical pathway. And so what we actually find is that when people get too like dopaminergic, dopamine heavy, when their mesolimbic pathway dominates their mesocortical pathway, what we actually wind up with is people who are unable to engage in action that is not immediately rewarding. So it's sort of like they can't do what they should and can only do what they want. Okay? So like you guys let me know whether that sort of makes sense in terms of something that you struggle with. Because that's like, this is what the neuroscience tells us, right? So we can look at these two different functions of executive function and like mesolimbic, what it does, and we can draw hypotheses based on the science of what the clinical presentation of this messed up circuitry looks like. So the next thing that we're going to talk a little bit about is the anterior cingulate cortex, okay? So now I'm going to explain a couple of things to y'all. The anterior cingulate cortex is involved in something called effort computation. And what effort computation means is that there's basically, anytime we take an act, this is the anterior cingulate cortex, anytime we are calculating an act, or anytime we're thinking about doing something, our mind essentially has something called an effort calculation. So it sort of says like, okay, I can do this and get this reward. This requires this much energy for this kind of reward. Or I can invest in a lot of energy for a lot of reward. Or I can invest a lot of energy for a low reward. Or I can invest very little energy for a high reward, right? So I can do something like spend 10 years becoming a doctor, which is a high effort, high reward. Sometimes I can even do things that my mind will tell me like, oh, there's no point in asking this person out because they'll never say yes. So that's a high effort, low reward strategy. And then even there are things that are low effort, high reward strategies. Like I'm going to spend all my money on Dogecoin, AMC, and GameStop, right? And I'm just going to, I'm going to spend $10 and I'm going to make 10,000. It's easy chat, easy done. Okay. So the anterior cingulate cortex is involved in all of these effort computations. And essentially what happens is that when we get impaired dopaminergic neurons in the nucleus accumbens, right? So the nucleus accumbens is in the mesolimbic pathway. What it actually does is changes the effect of our anterior cingulate cortex. And when it does that, what we essentially do is are unable to choose anything except for the low reward, low effort option. So I'm going to draw this out a little bit, okay? So let's understand what we're talking about. From the top, dopamine is a diverse structure that does all kinds of stuff in our brain. It does things like motivation and reward, executive function, and even things like movement. So we don't want to empty our brain of dopamine. That's a terrible, terrible idea. It means we won't be motivated to do anything. So when we look at motivation reward, this is something called the mesolimbic pathway. And when we look at executive function, this is mesocortical. The limbic system is our emotional circuit of the brain. The cortices are our frontal lobes. Okay, so mesocortical is planning. Mesolimbic, rewarding behavior. Okay, so sometimes there is a tension where the mesolimbic beats the rewarding mesocortical. What that means is that we're going to choose rewarding behavior over like planning and executing tasks over long periods of time. If we meditate, what we can do is reverse this because we're enhancing our cortical circuits. We're going to be able to do planned actions more than like immediately rewarding actions. So if we look at our frontal cortex, the frontal cortex is involved with things like impulse control, right? So I don't know if you all remember, but when we looked back at the Wikipedia thing over here, what we see is that ADHD is deficient in both of these pathways, especially the mesocortical pathway, more so than the mesolimbic pathway. Next thing that we're going to talk about now, this is where things get even more complicated, the anterior cingulate cortex. So this involves effort computation. So what this means is that sometimes your mind is saying, oh, this is not worth it. And when you alter the dopamine system here, this actually goes and messes up the anterior cingulate cortex and messes up your effort computation. So when you impair dopamine, the only choice that you can make is low effort for low reward, right? Remember, we've got effort, and then we can sort of do a 2x2 table, reward. So high effort, low effort, high reward, low reward. And basically, when we mess up our anterior cingulate cortex, this is the only quadrant that we can do things in. We can't afford to do anything that involves high effort for a high reward. And so like this is where this is going to become kind of important, because what we see in a dopamine detox is essentially going to be that people sort of get stuck in this particular pattern. So like, what is the neuroscience correlation with like what all of these things, what does this mean? How is this going to present clinically? Okay. What this sort of means, like this is what I look for in people who have messed up dopamine circuits. Okay. The things that you are motivated towards aren't fun. That's a better way to put it. So this is key, because essentially what happens, our mesolimbic pathway is sort of active, but something about our reward circuitry builds up tolerance, so it doesn't actually feel fun. So this is the other thing that happens, is that there's like, remember, there's this war between the mesocortical and the mesolimbic. So the second feature of like when your dopamine circuits are messed up is that you should do something, but you can't. This like weird basal mesolimbic circuit is actually ending up being stronger than the mesocortical circuit, which in turn means this part of your brain that is telling you, okay, these are the planned actions I need to take, I need to execute them in this way, is losing to the immediately rewarding behavior. This is just more of a clinical observation. This isn't really borne out in the neuroscience, but things that other people are highly motivated towards are hard for you. So this is not really borne out. I don't understand the neuroscience of this statement, but I wish I had something for y'all there, but I just don't. So like these are the three signs of like you needing a dopamine detox. Number one, there seems to be a high degree of like compulsion towards a behavior that does not feel enjoyable. So if we kind of think about that, like what is going on there, right? Because what's happening is that the part of your brain, and this is why it's important to understand that dopamine is not just a pleasure chemical, because you would think that if it was just a pleasure chemical and you no longer felt pleasure, then you would no longer engage in the behavior, right? So like if I don't enjoy playing video games, why the hell, like if I play League of Legends for 10 hours a day and I'm frustrated during most of it, why the hell do I constantly do that crap? So it's kind of weird, right? So we have to understand that dopamine is not just a pleasure chemical, because if it was a pleasure chemical and I was motivated towards a behavior and that behavior wasn't fun, then I would no longer be motivated towards it. So what that means is that like we have to understand that there are two different circuits going on in the brain, and that like dopamine can reinforce behaviors without necessarily leading to enjoyment. And it's that discrepancy which I really find people to be like, those are the kinds of people that benefit from a dopamine detox. So what's happening is your mesolimbic circuit is active and is pushing you towards a particular behavior, but then like your ability to experience pleasure from it has actually developed a sense of tolerance. What this means is that if, so like the thing about dopamine, the dopamine detox has nothing to do with your dopamine level. It has everything to do with your dopamine receptors. Okay. So basically this is what happens. In my brain, I have a neuron that releases a chemical signal into something called a synaptic cleft. And in the synaptic cleft, I have on the other side a neuron that has receptors. So what happens is I essentially I release neurotransmitter from one neuron and it moves over to the next neuron and activates the signal. What happens over time is that if I release a bunch of signal, the receiving neuron is like, hey, I'm getting way too much signal, and down-regulates the receiving end of the receptor. So the way that I kind of think about this is like, imagine that I have, a speaker volume and then the computer volume. If my computer volume is jacked all the way through the roof, what I'm going to do is turn down the speaker volume so that like the sound that the volume of the music ends up being pleasant, right? And if my computer volume is way down towards the bottom, what I'm going to do is turn up my speaker volume so that once again I have an equilibrium of like volume that I'm listening to. So our brain does the same thing with neurotransmitter signals. So for those of you who use caffeine, like when you start drinking caffeine, it can like keep you up all night. But as you drink caffeine on a daily basis, you develop a chemical dependence, which means that you down-regulate your caffeine receptors in your brain. So that if you want to stay up all night with caffeine, you actually have to end up drinking more. So this principle of physiologic tolerance is very well understood, is the same reason that, people can be like, light drinkers or heavy drinkers, right? Like you can be someone who's a lightweight or a heavyweight when it comes to drinking. And that all has to do with your degree of physiologic tolerance. With alcohol, there are other things involved. It's just not neurochemical because your liver's involved and stuff like that. But basically, essentially, the more signal you dump into your brain, the more your brain is going to downregulate that signal. So this is the other important thing. When that person said that you do this for 24 hours ain't going to do crap, because the neurophysiology of what's going on is receptor adaptation. So receptor adaptation requires weeks to equilibrate. So if you think about, if you go off of caffeine for 24 to 36 hours, you're not going to be detoxed off of caffeine, right? Like you're just going to be miserable for 24 hours and you're not going to be totally fine. So if you also think about alcohol addiction, so for example, alcohol addiction can take anywhere from like 5 to 6 days for the medically dangerous part. And then you can even have lingering effects of chronic alcohol use for weeks to months as your neurochemistry like readapts and your neurons start developing new cellular machinery and stuff like that. It gets actually quite complicated. So what we're going to do for dopamine detox, the goal is to fix that receptor regulation. Okay, so when I bombard my mind with dopamine, so now we're going to get to things like video games and technology. So when I use, like when I go onto Reddit, and I want you guys to really pay attention to this for a second, okay? When you go onto Reddit, like I know I do this, where I don't even think about it, right? I don't think to myself, oh, I'm really going to enjoy doing this. Like, wow, I can't wait to hop onto Reddit today. It's sort of like my mind is like kind of bored, or there's some sort of like, gap in what I'm doing. And my mind reflexively goes to like social media or like Reddit or something like that. And I click on the meme and I get that quick hit. It's not actually fun. It's not like when I'm if I go on vacation, I don't like think to myself, oh man, it would be so awesome to spend 6 hours a day just like on the internet browsing memes. Like you don't look forward to it, but it still is reinforcing in some way. So you guys see how it's like, it's not really like a craving. It's like sort of like a neuroscientific, behaviorally reinforced mechanism that's active. And we get that quick dopamine hit, we get that quick dopamine hit, we get that quick dopamine hit. So what we want to do through a dopamine detox is reset our levels, because what happens is when I play a video game for 10 hours a day, I'm getting a constant stream of dopamine. That constant stream of dopamine is going to downregulate my dopamine receptors. This also hasn't been studied, so this is a clinical observation based on principles of neuroscience, okay? And as our dopamine receptors get downregulated, we will enjoy things less, but something weird happens because the reinforcement circuitry, the behavioral circuitry, seems to stay intact. And that has something to do with probably other neurotransmitters and things like that. That's like the endocannabinoid system and habit formation and stuff. I'm not going to go into that now, but there's a part 2 to this lecture, which is really fascinating. So essentially what happens is as I get the constant stream of dopamine, it's sort of like if I'm sipping coffee throughout the day, my brain is going to adapt to that level and it's going to downregulate my dopamine receptors. Then we wind up in this situation where now that my dopamine receptors are kind of downregulated, other activities start to feel less pleasurable. Because if you think about the dopamine hit from, let's say, reading a book or going for a walk, these things start to feel less pleasurable. So this is the next thing to think about when you need to dopamine detox is, do activities that normal people seem to enjoy seem to like not be very enjoyable to you? If the answer is yes, then you need a dopamine detox, okay? So like, just to kind of summarize, like what we're looking for dopamine detox is if your life has a constant stream of dopamine. And what we're talking about is video game usage, social media usage. These are the things that kind of like bombard your brain with dopamine. If that's the case, and you wind up in this clinical presentation of feeling compelled or a compulsive behavior that does not actually lead to enjoyment. So if you play video games for 10 hours a day and like don't actually have fun, then you may need a dopamine detox. If you spend a bunch of time on social media and don't even enjoy it, you may need a dopamine detox. One person is mentioning pornography. That could absolutely be a part of it, right? So this is why we're not going to be intervention specific. We're not going to be like, addiction specific. What we're explaining is the neurochemistry of the dopamine reward system. And so whatever you do that results in this presentation makes dopamine detox potentially useful for you. Does that make sense? Like, it's not about what the addiction is. It's not about what the behavior is. It's about the clinical signs of a particular brain that is messed up in terms of dopamine reward system. Okay? So you feel compelled to do something, but you don't enjoy it. Things that other people tend to be able to do or be able to enjoy that you can't enjoy, you may want to consider a dopamine detox. And then the last thing is sort of like you're unable to control the part of your mind that is, or there's a war between like what you know you should do, but you end up just going towards the compulsive behaviors over and over and over again. Like that's the third sign, okay?